The prison epistles are called that because each one of them has some kind of reference to Paul being in chains, okay? And I think what I'm going to do, just because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to focus on the one that probably gets focused on the least, and that's Philemon. And I'll just make a couple of comments about Ephesians and Colossians because they're sometimes called synoptic in the sense that they're obviously parallel. There's a lot of parallels between them. And then say a little bit about Philippians. Probably written during Paul's house arrest. Remember, that's the end of the end of Acts 28, where Paul is in Rome and is under house arrest. And also, it's likely that all of these were written, particularly Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, probably written from about the same time and from the same place. So here are just a couple of quick comments about this, but where was Paul imprisoned? And I've presented it as if there were no discussion about that it's Rome. There are some other suggestions, Caesarea and Ephesus. When all is said and done, I think Rome is the most likely context. But the reason why people have suggested something different has to do with the fact that if you look at a map, we have looked at lots of maps, but when you look at a map, it's a long way from Rome to Ephesus or to Colossae. And so Philemon would have been in the church that met at Colossae, which is kind of the western central part of Turkey, and Rome is far away. So the idea that Onesimus could go and travel that amount of distance, people have suggested that's implausible. So they have said, well, maybe this was when Paul was in Ephesus, and that's recorded, or when he was in Caesarea. I think Caesarea doesn't help because as far as travel goes, it was probably as difficult to get from Colossae to Caesarea as it would have been to get from Colossae to Rome. Now, arguments for Rome, as I said, is that if you want to hide, a large city is a pretty good place to hide. So if Onesimus as a runaway slave is going to hide someplace, he's going to probably try to find refuge in Rome. And Paul would have been relatively accessible. We know that people could come and go. So all things considered, I think that there's good evidence to point to Rome, even though some people have tried to suggest other options. So let's just do a quick look at Ephesians. We won't get into really details of Ephesians. And as I said, what I'd like to do is to focus on the one that typically you don't have Bible studies on Philemon. You do have a lot of times Bible studies on Ephesians and Colossians. Okay, so some of the key issues that come out of Ephesians are the church, okay, eschatology, end times. There's a lot of apocalyptic kind of literature, sounding things in Ephesians, so age to come language, and a cosmic conflict. So we know at the end of Ephesians 6, we get the passage about spiritual warfare. So those are some of the key things. The spiritual warfare is actually even more in Ephesians because of the so-called power language. And so in Ephesians, there's a lot of language about God's power and God's power working powerfully. I mean, it almost feels redundant after a while. But it's, I think the best context for that is going to be the practice of magic and the prevalence of magic in Ephesus. So we'll look at that. Okay, now we're moving into those parts of Paul's letters that are often challenged. So Ephesians is frequently challenged. Colossians is challenged. Remember when we were talking before, we were looking at Romans, and I said, virtually unchallenged that it's written by Paul. Galatians, same deal. Now we're moving into those that are more challenged. I don't think there are reasons to doubt that Paul wrote it, and I take very seriously, as we've talked about, the idea that the epistle claims to be written by Paul. So I think there's some important issues that if self-referential to be by Paul, we need to take that seriously. Tychius will tell you how I'm doing, or Tychius will tell you how I'm doing. I mean, that would be a blatant lie if the person whom he sent was not really going to be telling how Paul was doing. So there's just things that I would look at that. The reason why they say this is because there's perceived to be differences, differences between Paul's theology, so to speak. And I guess what I would just say is the claim usually goes in Ephesians, Paul talks about the church and this power language that I've talked about, God's power and things like that. Whereas he doesn't talk about that in other epistles. To me, I think that's often overstated. And secondly, remember, we're into this occasional understanding of Paul's letters. They're written in response to particular occasions. So it seems likely that there's a reason why Paul is talking about the church and the unity of the church. Ephesians 2 talks about the dividing wall coming down and the unity. And I'm going to just make a comment right now because I was asked to say something about the pastoral epistles and some of the more easy to interpret passages like 1 Timothy 2. And I just want to point out that as we're talking about Ephesus, this is the background for understanding Timothy, because Timothy is in Ephesus. And so if we're going to understand the context of 1 and 2 Timothy, some of the things I'm saying about Ephesians will apply because it's the same context. Okay? So I'll point out a few of those things. And then, as I said, some of the real developments in Ephesians, I don't think that they reflect a different author as much as they reflect the unique situation in Ephesus. So, I mean, I've said before that we'll go over these authorship things pretty quickly, but to me I think that's important to establish that there's no compelling reason to say that Paul didn't write it. What's the relationship between the two? Well, for some people that's a problem because it's like, why would you, if you have one, why would you have the other? There's a lot of overlap. So, as I said, the Ephesians is too close to Colossians. It's an imitation of it. I think there's a couple ways we can think about it. One, unless somebody is explicitly trying to imitate, it's hard to believe that these two letters that do have quite a few similarities could be written by two different people. So I think just at face value, the argument really would go that we're talking about one person writing them. I think, as I put down there, Ephesians is probably a development or expansion of Colossians. People go back and forth on this, which came first. But I do think that it's important to realize Colossians is dealing with some kind of unnamed heresy that seems to be some kind of Jewish mysticism. Ephesians seems to be dealing with something that is occult-like magic or something along those lines. They are different situations. And so I think that they're really, in some respects, they're not so close. I mean, actually, they're about 100 miles apart. But their situations that are being addressed are not so close. They do have different emphases. But also, as I said, I think the two backgrounds are likely the best explanation for what accounts for the differences. It's not surprising, too, that if there were some, I think what's likely is that if we look at the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation, and Ephesus is the first church addressed, it's possible that Ephesus was understood as kind of the mother church. And so it's not surprising that Paul would write something similar to the church in Ephesus and then use that as the basis, or I should rephrase it, if he's written something to Colossians, it wouldn't be surprising if he reframed that and used that for Ephesus. So despite the fact that there's a lot written and sometimes assumed, I don't think, as I said, that there are compelling reasons. More important for my purposes, or our purposes right now, would just be to talk a little bit about the background of Ephesus. Major trading and religious center. Major. Unusually wealthy because of all of the temple offerings. And I think that's really important. As I said, population of something like 500,000, which is huge. And think about it, in the 15th century, okay, the population of London and Paris was about 250,000. So 500,000 in the first century, which is, there was a significant decline in Europe's population at certain points because of disease and war and things. But still, that's pretty significant. If you go to Ephesus today, you're not on a harbor, but if you look at, there's some really good pictures in the book, and there's one particular picture that's very famous, but it's shot from up in the theater and looking down the Cardo, looking down the main road, and then they'll tell you, and the harbor is right there. And you look and you go, I see nothing but land for a long time. That has to do with the fact that the river that runs into Ephesus, called the Meander River, okay, so how fast is the water going? The Meander River is bringing down silt from, there's a lot of very tall mountains, some 8,000-foot mountains, so you get the glacial silt and other kinds of silt coming down and then meandering through the Lycus Valley. So today when you visit Ephesus, the ocean is quite a bit, it's several miles away because of all of that silt. But at the time, it was a thriving harbor. And Ephesus is one of the best excavated cities that you can visit. It's amazing to see. Extremely well excavated and a lot to see. It's, I think for the places that I visited, the only place that really rivals it is Pompeii as far as an excavation, which is really a staggering excavation to see. The Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the world, and probably the best way that I can help you to understand it, I could say things like it's 4 times the size of the Parthenon. It had 100,000 square feet, 127 60-foot columns, but maybe I could rephrase it and say it this way. It was the size of 2 football fields. That usually is an easier connection point. The size of 2 football fields. Okay, a 60-foot column. Okay, a 60-foot column could be like 6 stories, 127 of those around. It's huge. It was absolutely huge. And people came from all over the world, the Roman Empire, to come and to visit this. So it's a very important city in many, many respects. As I said, a large population of Jews, but it was also a site for the emperor cult and for one of the largest cities, a famous center for magic, a famous center for magic. The emperor cult cities competed for the opportunity to be able to have a temple that was constructed for the emperor and to offer sacrifices. In our time period, when Ephesians is being written, probably that would be for Caesars who had died and then were believed to have become gods. When we get into Revelation, it is possible then we have entered into that time period where we would have temples that would be built for Caesars who were still alive. So this is going to be an issue that we're going to talk more about when we get to Revelation, because it's going to cause a very significant problem for believers. And the problem has to do with the fact that obviously, believers are not going to be able to offer sacrifices to Augustus as a god. And so they're going to have a real problem with that, what to do about that. But on the other hand, in order to show that they're good Romans and to show that they have piety and they're faithful to the state, they're going to be required to do that. So that's going to become a big issue. Now, a couple of comments about the Temple of Artemis, a few more comments. There's pictures that you probably have seen in the book of the statues to Artemis. Artemis is a very interesting figure. The Roman name is Diana. She's associated with the protecting goddess of the hunt. So sometimes you see her depicted as a huntress. She was joined, this often happened in the Roman Empire when the Roman influence came. It was very syncretistic. Remember we talked about that? So it would often join with things that were already existing. So what merged into the Roman idea was the Eastern god of fertility, Artemis. Also kind of understood as the goddess of fertility, and the way that she was worshipped was with temple prostitution. So now we're getting a lot of mixing that are coming in. The figure of Artemis is really kind of grotesque, actually. She's a multi-breasted figure with oftentimes bulls and other figures kind of around her. The bull was a symbol of the Roman Empire, but I think the book has a picture of the statue. It's easy to find, but it's a distorted figure. It's meant to show all these images and symbols of fertility. And those were the little figurines. You can find them in museums, the little figurines that were being sold. So great is the god of Artemis, and the little figurine statues that were being sold. There was also somehow an idea that was linked to a meteor that fell from the sky that landed there, and that was also worshipped and brought into this whole worship as well. So that's a little bit of the background. The converts, as I said, probably were either the result of Paul's earlier visit or Aquila and Priscilla. So we come back to them and see their impact. Obviously, we see the pattern of starting in a synagogue and then moving. We also have a lot of opposition in Ephesus. So we get this account of Paul walking by and even people kind of his shadow falling over them, and they're touching his cloth, and miraculous things happen. I think that that's an important thing to kind of pay attention to, because people have discounted that and have said, that this is kind of a bizarre little comment where, Paul is walking along, and as I said, let me just get the reference to it. As long as I'm here, let me just go ahead and read this one other verse that I think is very helpful. This is the seven sons of Sceva, and if you remember, this is very interesting. So these two kind of go hand in hand. The first is about Paul, then it's about the seven sons. And God was doing extraordinary miracles by the hand of Paul, so that even handkerchiefs or aprons that had touched his skin were carried away to the sick, and their diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out of them. Then some of the itinerant Jewish exorcists undertook to invoke the name of the Lord Jesus over those who had evil spirits, saying, I adjure you by the Jesus whom Paul proclaims. 7 sons of a Jewish high priest named Sceva were doing this, but the evil spirit answered them, Jesus I know, and Paul I recognize, but who are you? And I'll stop there, but I just wanted to point that out because frequently those are very difficult to understand, those passages. One, I would say it's in that context of occult practices and magic that it's not surprising that God would work in ways that are staggering. We don't see other places where people bring a handkerchief or an apron to Paul and it somehow gets this magical power that goes back and heals people. So in some respects, I think we can understand this as a contextualization, because God is going to work in a way that is going to demonstrate his power in a way that people are going to see. And I won't go into details on this, but I think all of us have had this happen. But in ministry experiences, I think there have been times when I have seen God work in a way, in a particular context, where that would speak to people, where I haven't seen him do that in other contexts. And then it brings up the question about healing. I mean, sometimes people are healed, sometimes people are not healed. But I really think there's obviously God working out his greater promises and purposes. But I also want to pay attention to the fact, though, about the sons of a Jewish high priest involved in magic. This is a very complicated problem, right? Okay, this should not happen. Unfortunately, Jews were known in the ancient world as being good magicians, good at magic spells and things like that. So one of the things that happens, we won't look at it, but in Acts 19, is the burning of the books, the burning of the scrolls. And if you remember, there were all these people who came, and there was something like they said, let me just read the verses better than paraphrasing. So it goes on, it says, a large number of those who had magic arts brought their books together and burned them in sight of all, and they counted the value of them and found that it came to be 50 pieces of silver. Now, let me just make a few comments. The magic books would have been books that had spells, and you can still find those. I mean, they've been excavated. There was the idea that there was magic in a name. So a lot of times in these spells, you could see the name Yahweh or Jesus, because those were believed to be names that had a certain amount of magic to them. So that's what's so interesting about when the demons, they're casting out by the Lord Jesus Christ whom Paul preaches. What's very interesting about this is the demons say, we know Paul, we recognize Paul, we know Jesus, but who are you? In other words, that little section in Acts 19 is showing that it's not the name Jesus that has the power, it is the relationship with Jesus that's important. And I think that's very important. I think it's very, very important to understand, because the demons do not recognize the name. They know who Jesus is, but they don't recognize somebody just using the name as if it were an incantation. It's, who are you? And the implication clearly there is, if you're not related to Jesus, then who are you, and what does his name have to do with things? The other thing is the 50,000 pieces of silver. I did the math on this. I was just trying to be very, very, very conservative on this. But if you figured out that that's about 50,000 days worth of wages, and just assuming that we have a 52-year work week and it's about $30,000 a year salary, then if you recalculate that, that comes out to be about 137 years, over $4 million. So this is not a small thing that happens. So what we see is when Paul and the gospel come, Paul bringing the gospel into Ephesus, first of all, it's something we haven't talked a lot about before, but a city now that really has a very clear occultic demonic presence. But also, there's any number of reasons why people are going to be upset with Paul, but at least one of them would be the economic impact of the gospel. The burning of all those magic books, there's people who are going to be upset. They may be upset and call it spiritual. They may be upset for the honor of Artemis, but they're also pretty upset because of the financial impact, the economic impact. So that's a little bit of the background, just to kind of help us to understand. A large church, very large church. Acts 19:10 says that from Ephesus, all of Asia heard the gospel. And I think that's a plausible claim, because it means many people came to Ephesus. Somebody like Epaphras, who was converted by Paul and brings the gospel back to Colossae. Okay, it's possible that the churches that are addressed in Revelation are founded at this time.